Thank you for welcoming us tonight. And what I'm going to discuss tonight is the Mayan calendar and the issue of time acceleration. And the theory of time acceleration and the Mayan calendar was discovered by Dr. Carl Johan Kallman, who is a Swedish biologist, and probably quite a few of you in the room are already familiar with Carl's work. So as I get into this, I want a sense of what you guys know. First of all, how many of you have been exposed to Kallman's work or to the Mayan code? Okay, the vast majority. That's really great. I still will address it so that people who have not been exposed yet can understand what's going on here. And then how many in the room have read either the Pleiadian Agenda or Alchemy of Nine Dimensions, or both? Okay, so about half of you are familiar with my work, and then a very large number of you are familiar with Kallman's. So as I get into this discussion tonight, it's not going to make much sense and to like why I'm adopting Kallman's theory unless you understand something about my own work and how my own work relates to Kallman, because I'm the author of 11 or 12 books, and I've worked in a number of fields: astrology and multidimensionality and past life regression under hypnosis, even art history in the early stages of my career. And normally somebody who has developed in so many fields doesn't adopt the theory of someone else. But what happened for me in 2005 is that I was so profoundly struck by how Kallman had a missing piece of my own work. And that's where what's happened with Carl and I is that we've kind of crossed each other's paths, because as it turns out, when I finally contacted him about my feelings about what he had discovered in relationship to what I discovered myself, Carl immediately said, "Well, I've been reading you all these years also." So we're going along with like that for a long time, where I was learning, he was actually learning from me, and I didn't read him until 2004. But as you will see when I get into the material tonight, as far as I'm concerned, what Carl has discovered is of monumental importance. And so after being a publisher for so many years in the Mayan field and then working in my own research, I'd like to kind of give you a sense of how that stuff all fits together before we get into time acceleration. So basically, the part of my research that's very deeply connected with Kallman's work is the Pleiadian Agenda. This came out in 1995, and Alchemy of Nine Dimensions, which came out in 2004, and also a book called Catastrophobia, which I don't have up here tonight, but I probably will allude to, because those three books are actually very deeply connected with this research relationship with Kallman. And so the way this whole thing happened, at this point, to me, is extremely meaningful, because the information that I'm teaching and working with and attempting to understand as far as Kallman's research is concerned, the information for me first came through totally on the intuitive. And the way that happened was in the fall, and by the way, if I go back to the fall of 1994, at that time I was a publisher and also the author of a number of books which were basically research-oriented books. One of the things that we have up here is a trilogy called the Mind Chronicles Trilogy. And the Mind Chronicles Trilogy spans 100,000 years of human consciousness by means of past life regression. But I still did it in a very academic way by working with 3 therapists. Part of it was a master's in theology from Loyola Mundelein in Chicago, if you can believe it. And the point of doing 100 past life regressions was to attempt to look at whether the therapist is influencing the sessions as well as doing the session work. So I tended to be, I wouldn't say a left brain person, but certainly a very research-oriented person, and certainly somebody who was extremely interested all the time in identifying and clarifying whether something was accurate or not. So then everything changed in October, November, September, October of 1994, when I was sitting around my house, and by the way, this sort of thing happens when I'm doing something really mundane, like the laundry or taking the trash out. It's always like that. I do tend to have visions, and usually it's like I say, when I'm doing something mundane. And so I was sitting around the house, I think I was folding laundry, and like a sphere of light appeared about 4 or 5 feet out in front of my face. I later learned when I started researching sacred geometry that it was an icosahedron, but I did not know that at the time. And this sphere of light, which had triangles in it and lines of light coming into it and everything like that, was pulsing and radiating, and it seemed to be sending lines of light just out into infinity. And of course, I was just absolutely entranced. I sat there for about 20 or 30 minutes with this thing vibrating in front of me, knowing that it was going to get me into really big trouble. You know what I mean? It was like, but I didn't have any choice about it, because I could tell that whatever it was of extreme importance. Well, then the next thing that happened, this was, by the way, it's like either August or September of 1995. And I later found it extremely interesting that this is where Edward Witten was able to bring in the calculations for superstring theory. And I'll give you a sense of why I think that's important in a moment. But what happened for me was just simply not fun at all. Because first of all, I started contemplating, I basically had been like implanted, you know? And I could tell that whatever that data bank was, I could tell that it had to do with physics, and it had to do with quantum mechanics, it had to do with cosmology. Cosmology I was comfortable with because I was somewhat knowledgeable, but I could tell that it involved a whole bunch of complicated sciences, and there was one really big problem. I didn't know anything about those sciences. In fact, I can tell you a funny story. After the Pleiadian agenda came out, and I was running around signing books and doing talks, I was at a bookstore in California, and a man came up to me who said he was a physicist, and he looked like a physicist. He looked like a big Russian physicist with a really burly beard and intense eyes and eyebrows and all that, and he was kind of heavy, kind of had a big belly. And he sat down at my table, and he looked at me, and I thought, oh my God. He said, Barbara, everything is vibration. I thought he was coming on to me. I can't even stress to you. In fact, I remember one time I was on a radio show with Fred Allen Wolf, and somebody called up who knew that I didn't have a brain in my head as far as what was in the book. And so because see, what's in the Pleiadian agenda is a lot of physics, a lot of cosmology, a lot of really advanced theory that later on turned out to be accurate. But a lot of it was proven after the book came out. So this caught the attention of some physicists and mathematicians. But some guy called up at 12 midnight to a radio show that I was doing in San Francisco and said, Barbara, what are the 4 forces? And I'm sitting there with Fred Allen Wolf, you know, and I said, I have no idea. You know, it was like that. So the way it worked out was that this hologram was in my consciousness, and I didn't know what to do with it. Next thing that happened is I started getting tinnitus. If anybody in the room has ever had ear ringing, tinnitus is horrible. And I could tell, at that time, by the way, I was Barbara Marciniak's publisher, and we were working on Bringers of the Dawn at Barron Company. And so one of the things I used to do with authors is the way I worked with them is I got to know them, and then when it came to getting their books done, their books were better because I understood how they did their thing. So I watched Barbara channel, and I tuned into that, and I went, well, I know what I'm going to do. I'm just going to channel this thing. Never channeled before, and I hope I never channel again, to be honest with you. It's incredibly stressful on your adrenal system and on your physical body. So what I did is I called together a group of people who had the ability to question me regarding this hologram that had come in. So we did 18 sessions that lasted approximately 2 to 3 hours. They were taped, then they were transcribed. Then all of that material was put into my computer, and then I made it into a book. And that was the easy part. Since at Barron Company, I did the acquisitions, and I also was a structural editor. So I had the ability to take any body of material, even if I don't know what it's about, and put it all together into a book. It's just my skill. So no problem turning it into a book. Got the book all done, and then here's a piece of the story that I think is one of the most interesting parts of it. The book was finished by May of 1995, so the channel sessions were like November through March, and then the book was finished in May. And what I mean by finished is it was ready, it went to the editorial people so they could work on it. And boy, was it a mess for them to work on. I think it's one of the worst books that anybody's ever had to work on it there because of the kind of material that was in it. But what happened was, I was the acquisitions editor of Aaron Company while this was being edited during the summer of 1995. And during that summer, I received 4 queries for the same book. Now, what I mean by that is I received 1 finished manuscript, 2 complete outlines, and 1 very complex phone conversation from 4 different authors. Now, when I say the same material, all 4 of these people had, like myself, mine was already an editorial, so that was that. But they had received a book that had to do with the issue of a photon band coming through our solar system and changing the actual physics of the solar system. And that process was creating a situation. I have to go back to remember this. Because I'm thinking of these other 4 authors. Basically, all 4 authors and myself had 9 dimensions of consciousness. The issue of this photon band and this acceleration had to do with accessing 9 levels of consciousness, and these levels of consciousness were being influenced by Earth, the iron core crystal, the telluric realm under the planet, the collective mind, and the Anunnaki, by the way, of Nibiru, by the Pleiadians, the Sirians, the Andromedans, and beings from the Orion star system. In other words, what I'm getting at is this was not for people who wrote about love and light and prosperity. This was an extremely specific data bank. So I have to assume it, at least, that this was a transmission. That's the only thing that I can assume at this point, and I think, judging by how things have gone since then, I think it's a valid assumption. And before I get into this issue of this transmission, I would like to point out for anybody who's in the room who knows my material already, this data bank is really not all that different than all the other great spiritual systems that have come through to us. So there's a lot of similarities to the Kabbalah, for example. And so I don't want to make it look like this data bank is anything that's all that incredibly unique. But it seems to be a body of material that seems to be an important communication for us at this time, as far as I can see.